It is shocking to see the scale and speed of rural tourism development in China in the past few years, especially in the historical villages. Under the concern on preservation, or more fundamentally, the awareness on economic potentials shown by the rapidly growing tourism market, many villages are starting to develop rural tourism to thrive the local economy. The promising tourism market is attracting massive capital flows toward China historical villages, leading to a new geography in the countryside. So this research aims to understand and unpack this phenomenon. What does China's rural tourism development exactly mean in this modern context? To start with, urban and rural development has a special social-political background in China. Urban and rural are treated differently. The most well-known example is the household registration system. It assigns residents a rural or urban status, which restricts mobility and respectively corresponds to different social regulations. The dual structure resulted in a huge economic gap between urban and rural, causing the current rural underdevelopment problem. The urban-rural income ratio has kept increasing since the economic reform which started in the 1980s. Even today, the government still sees urban as the ultimate goal of social development. In the most recent plan, the government set the goal to have 60% of the population living in urban by 2020. But it is ignored that this also means 600 million people will still live in the countryside and suffering from the underdevelopment situation. However, the current thriving rural tourism industry can be used to tackle the rural surviving challenges. To thoroughly understand the current tourism development, the research started from the discussion of the epistemology of urban and rural. Early in 1960, Henry Lefebvre argued for an understanding of urban. He built this implosion-explosion model to show how the capitalist process leads to a border transformation of territory, landscape, and environment. Neuberner furthered Lefebvre's idea by enlarging the scale to what he calls planetary urbanization, implying an underlying global capitalist system that integrates even the most remote area into the worldwide urbanization process. The long-standing city-centric perspective has sorted social spaces based on spatial types, which blur the underlying connection between urban and rural. Therefore, urban should be understood as a process unfolding across the whole world within the capitalist context, instead of a fixed, bonded settlement type. The rural is the social frontier as well as the urban. In this sense, rural tourism in China should be understood as the process of extended urbanization. First, China's rural tourism market has been stimulated by a national scale of land and property investment. The local government's reliance on land finance has further facilitated the property market. Second, the urban periphery has been reshaped by the extended urban life and infrastructure development. Considering the tremendous scale of cities and infrastructure investment in China, this is reshaping the countryside dramatically. Third, the explosive growth of China's middle class has further facilitated the extension of urban life and promoted consumption and rural tourism. More and more people are willing to pay more time and money for the leisure life. Although capitalist urbanization is spreading rapidly, it should be emphasized that the Chinese economy remains centralized and top-down. Historical villages play a significant role in rural tourism development. Therefore, it is not a coincidence that the rural tourism market started to boom in 2012, while the government announced the first list of traditional villages in the same year. However, traditional villages is not the only national-level designation for historical villages in China. There is also a designation called historical and cultural villages, and they have several differences. The designation of historical and cultural villages has stricter criteria. Although it started in 2003, it has 276 in total. The number of traditional villages is much larger, around 4,000 in total. The distribution of traditional villages and historical and cultural villages shows different spatial patterns. Therefore, a quantitative analysis was created to compare the two types of designation systems to see whether the designation of historical villages are related to the local economic situation, or they are pure preservation actions. Factors such as the number of tourist attractions, tourism revenue, urban average income, population, primary industry revenue, the proportion of primary industry, and density of roads are selected. The analysis was based on provincial data. According to the thresholds, the relationship between the number of traditional villages and economic factors was considerably weak. In contrast, the designation of historical and cultural villages shows a stronger relationship. The result shows that the province with higher tourism revenue, higher urban average income, higher density of roads tend to have more historical and cultural villages. Province with higher proportion of primary industry had fewer historical and cultural villages. The location of historical and cultural villages would tend to be adjacent to the transportation system. At the same time, historical and cultural villages were coincidentally located away from areas reserved as farmlands. The government utilized the brand of historical and cultural villages to stimulate the rural tourism industry and economic development. Therefore, the designation of historical and cultural villages were more prone to be in provinces that are more economically developed. Since the rural tourism industry has grown rapidly in the last few years and has shown huge economic potential, the government has started the designation of traditional villages as a serious concern to the general challenge that China's historical villages are facing. Therefore, the blossoming of rural tourism is a result of the extended urbanization process and centralized control of the government. To better understand it, I select Anhui Province as a site to specifically study how the rural society is reshaped by the tourism development. Anhui Province is in eastern China, adjacent to the Yangtze River Delta economic zone, which is near to many large urban agglomerations such as Shanghai and Hangzhou. The hotel data is used as the main indicator to evaluate and specialize the tourism industry. Meanwhile, 4A and 5A tourist destinations are other layers to show the general tourism development condition. They are rated by the government based on the quality of travel experience. 5A is the highest. The map shows that rural tourism has formed new socio-economic patterns. The distribution of hotels in cities shows strong clusters, while the distribution of hotels in rural area is more separated, more random, with even higher prices. The zoom-in mapping further articulates how rural tourism effectively gentrified the countryside, even leading to high-end consumption practice. I magnify the circles that represent the hotel price to visualize the new geography formed by the rural tourism. This map also shows that the current rural tourism fever has expressed a strong fancy for historical features and traditional culture. Most of the rural tourism projects are distributed in the region with historical villages. This seems to demonstrate the previous conclusion that rural tourism is elaborately planned and intervened by the government. These analyses on census data also portray the social-spatial transformations caused by rural tourism development. Furthered by a series of site trips and field investigation, which unfortunately are unable to show due to the time limit of this video, a diagram was created to summarize and articulate the formation of the recent rural tourism development in China. The capitalist system has led to the process of extended urbanization, which unfolds across the whole society. Therefore, rural tourism should be understood under the process of extended urbanization, which has formed a new social and economic geography in the countryside. Although it seems that the current craze of rural tourism has derived from nostalgia among urban tourists, rural tourism is essentially a consumption culture of urban tourists to distinguish class and social status based on urban taste and culture. On the other hand, the consumption culture is also stimulated by the globalized capitalist process. And all of these processes are facilitated by government's centralized control and urban-driven model, which excessively focus on urban benefits, which finally distort local identity, and in many cases exclude the rural residents.